Okay, so we're going to learn about trees, obviously, through this program. The very first thing I'm going to talk about is tree anatomy. I don't think that you can really learn about trees until you know the parts they're made from. So, with that in mind, we're going to start looking at what those parts are, how they work within that system, and what makes a tree. So, when you're done with all of this, you should be able to answer that question: what is a tree? And it starts with the definition, and the definition that we're going to talk about is the one that was um, put together by a man named Alex Scheigel. He's the father of modern arboriculture. He's where a lot of our current knowledge originated. He did a lot of work studying trees and their biology and physiology and how they actually work and respond to the world around them. And he's the man that coined the current definition that we're using. So if you want to look up other individuals that are pioneers in the field of arboriculture or people that really contributed to the way that we do things now, Alex Scheigel is one that you should be looking up. The definition that he really talked about, or the definition that he came up with for a tree is this one that you're looking at now. A long-lived perennial that is a woody and compartmentalizing organism, right? Really complicated. Doesn't really make sense. It's not the simplest definition ever in the history of words, but it really does capture what a tree is and what makes it different from other organisms, other woody or not really woody, but other plants. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at what the definition says. And the core definition says that trees are long-lived. It says that. And it's correct. It's absolutely correct. Trees live for a long time. Or at least most trees do. But it's that idea that they have a set lifespan, and we do have that conversation. We tend to talk about how long trees live. You'll hear somebody say, well, that tree lives 20 years or 30 years, or that tree lives 50 or 60 years, and it's that's not a fair explanation of how long they live, or a fair way to look at how they really work, how their biology really functions. Trees, if you give them the perfect environment, where they have everything that they need nutritionally, they have good water, temperature, perfect amount of sunlight, they don't have any kind of pests or pathogens or anything that bothers them, they really can live indefinitely. There's not an off switch inside their genetics. So what we're dealing with when it comes to trees and their lives, be careful that you don't put those limits on there without understanding why they're there. Every tree that's ever died, it didn't die as a result of its biology or failure in its physiology. What it died from was a failure to be able to adapt to changes in its environment, or it was unable to defend itself against a pathogen or pest or something. So every tree that you see that's ever died or ever failed, that was a function of the world around it, the environment changing enough that it couldn't deal with it anymore, or something attacking it. They do slow down as they age. So older trees, more mature trees, they really have a more difficult time adapting to changes in their environment, so it makes them more susceptible or more vulnerable to those changes, and that can definitely cause decline and failure and death of a tree. But it's not because the tree decided it was time to die. It's not because the tree decided I'm done living. That's not why it died. It died because it was no longer able to deal with what was going on around it or what was happening to it. So keep that in mind when you're working on trees out there, or you're pursuing this career, because it's something I touch on occasionally, and I think is a core belief of what we're trying to teach here, is that arboriculture and arborists have the potential not just to affect trees now or your customers, or the municipality, or the company where you're working. But you're really working with something that the benefit is immeasurable because of this time scale we're talking about, because of those plants' ability to live for so long. We have the ability in this career to physically touch the future and to contribute to it in a beneficial way. And that's not just tomorrow, that's years and decades and maybe centuries. That's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I think there's not a lot of other careers that offer that. Not a lot of other jobs that give you that opportunity to really touch the future, to really be part of that and to contribute that. So keep that in mind. I think there's some value in that legacy, and it's something to be proud of. And I really do feel that that's one of the real reasons that trees are important, and it gives us that opportunity. And it really is something I feel strongly about, and we feel strongly about here teaching this to you. So I realize that you've got the potential there to really make a difference. But it also works in our definition. So as we're going through this, to understand that definition and to get a better idea of where that potential for that life comes from, that long life comes from, we have to understand what it means to be a woody perennial, or what the woody part of that definition is. We have to start at the core of the tree. So we start with anatomy, the parts of the tree. The first part, basic building block of the tree, is a cell. It's a plant cell. From there, we move into tissues, organs, but cells are the basic building blocks of the tree. That's what it's made out of. And plant cells are a little different than animal cells. They have some different structures within them, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But primarily, the difference between animal cells and plant cells is the cell wall. They have a double wall, and that helps lend some rigidity to that cell. That's where we start to get some support for that plant. This is all plants, not just trees, but this is part of what helps them hold themselves up. And the way that trees reinforce this structure is part of why they can get so tall. But it's also part of where we get that woody definition from. So we're going to talk about that as we move on, but cells are where we're starting. Everything's made out of cells, and trees are no different. They also exhibit a growth pattern called indeterminate growth. What indeterminate growth is the tree's ability to continue to grow. And when we talk about, at least partially talk about plant growth, what we're talking about is cell division and elongation. Remember, we talked about cells. Elongation and division at the tips of stems, root tips, twigs, anywhere that there's an end to that tree, the end of the branch, the end of the twigs, the end of the stem, there are cells there. And trees grow by dividing, so those cells divide. One becomes two, and then those get longer, they elongate. So this is how we get the first step in our growth, and this is part of how, or part of why trees live as long as they do and respond to their environment in the way they do, is because they never really stop growing, and this is where that growth takes place. This is also why, if you have ever seen anybody drive a nail into a tree or spike into a tree, it never changes where it's at. It always stays the same height off the ground. That's not where the tree's growing at. The tree gets taller, it gets longer, branches get longer at the tips. The word that you're going to see repeated a lot through these is meristem. Meristem just means a point where growth is taking place, where new cells are being born, where that division is taking place. So the end of the branch, end of those twigs, the end of the roots, is an apical meristem. That's growth at the tip or the apex, apical meristem. There's also secondary meristems, and we will get into that too. That's where we get the other type of growth that trees undergo, and that's lends directly to their what the definition means. Meristematic tissue continues to divide for the life of the tree. They grow until they die. That's how they respond to 99% of what's going on with them. That's how they respond to the world, is through growth. That's how they defend themselves. So they never stop growing. Once you get cell division and elongation, they start to get a job. They get jobs assigned to them. We'll talk about that too. So the pattern of plant growth that we get, what it becomes, what type of tissue it becomes, what kind of part of the tree that it becomes, depends a lot on the location of where the meristems are. Like I said, if they're in the branch tips or those apical meristems, the definition for apical meristem will tell you tips of roots and shoots, and all that means is any branch, any twig, any root, just the end of it. That is primary growth. That's growth in one direction. That's growth up, out, getting taller, branches getting longer. Now, lateral meristem, this is a secondary meristem. We have two spots where the trees are growing. We have apical meristem at the ends, and we have a lateral meristem. It sounds a little complicated when you start talking about secondary growth. Lateral meristem is located near the outside of the tree. It's usually in the vascular tissue. In trees, it is always in vascular tissue. It's what generates new vascular tissue. What is vascular tissue? That's tissue where water or sugar is moving inside the tree. We'll talk about that a little bit too. Moving on here. Supports the tree, holds it up. It lends some rigidity to the tree. It's also where water, nutrients are moved up from the roots to the top of the tree or to the ends of the shoots, and where sugars that are produced on the outside of the tree are moved back down through the tree to be used where they're needed. So we have two different types of vascular tissue that are created in this lateral meristem, and you can see in this picture, that little blue line, it's not a very thick area. It's fairly skinny, like one cell wide within the tree. And to the outside of that, it's creating phloem. To the inside, it's creating xylem. Xylem is where water moves in the tree. Phloem is where sugar moves in the tree. So these are your two major types of vascular tissue. There are some others that we're going to discuss, but these are primarily or two of the major types of vascular tissue, and they're broken down into other cell types within that tissue. But xylem moves water, phloem moves sugar. If you can remember that, you're going to have at least that part of the test. If you get to that point where you're certifying, or if you just want to know how things move in a tree, if you can remember those two things and where they're at, you're going to know where 99% of what's moving in a tree and where it's at. The lateral meristem supplies cells to the tree. Obviously, this is where cells are being generated. It is meristematic tissue, but the important part with this is it's secondary growth. This is where trees get bigger around. This is why they don't just have one little stem. This is why they have a trunk. This is why they have large branches. You grow up and then you grow out. And this is where that growing out part happens. So as those cells are being produced, wood is being produced, that vascular system is being generated, the tree's getting bigger around. You can see this most notably being represented in tree rings. This is that annual layer of vascular production being generated within that secondary meristem, that lateral growth being generated in that layer. So after we get cell division, we get that initial cell division in those meristems. And it doesn't matter if we're talking the apical meristem, that growing point at the tips, or if we're talking our secondary or lateral meristem, it doesn't matter what area in the tree we're talking. Anywhere that there's active cell division going on, where it's growing taller, where it's growing bigger around, that's what we're talking about. After division, new cells are assigned a job. They go through a process called differentiation, and that's what differentiation means. Is it means they got a job. It's nothing more complicated than that. Most of the time, they'll have the same job that they had, or the cells before them had, before they underwent division. They'll just kind of keep going down that same path. So the next cell in line will have the same job. It's kind of like your son taking the same job that dad had. It's going to be that same job. That doesn't mean that happens every time. There are some cells that don't necessarily get assigned the same job. More importantly, they get or they have the opportunity to change jobs throughout their life. Parenchyma cells, and we'll talk a little more about what they do, because they do have some pretty important functions in the tree with movement and defense and those kind of things. But out of all the cell types in the tree, this type of cell, parenchyma cells, or parenchyma, you can say it however you want. I'm sure there's people on either side of that'll correct you one way or the other. But these cells, throughout their life, they retain the ability to change jobs. So they're going to be a parenchyma cell. They're going to be a parenchyma cell, and I'm going to use it both ways, just so nobody, if you're using it one way or the other, you don't feel bad. You can say it however you want. But those cells, if they begin as that type of cell, through their entire life, they can change jobs. They can become other things, kind of like stem cells in animals. They can become other things if they need to. Other cells, especially those inside the tree, deeper inside the tree, in the older xylem of the tree, the older water-moving vascular portion of the tree, are shut off. The tree does have the ability to turn off cells. It's called apoptosis, if you want to know what the term is. But they can turn cells off. The tree can turn cells off selectively. So certain parts of the tree, xylem being the major part that we're talking about, they don't need to be alive to do their job. Water movement from the ground, from the roots to the top of the tree, for the most part, is free. It doesn't take any energy for the tree to do that. And we'll talk about that a little more later on, how that works. But it doesn't need to be inside living tissue. You can think of water moving up through a straw. That it doesn't need to be alive for that to work. So the tree doesn't spend resources on anything it doesn't have to. They really are trying to survive. They're great survivors. They do everything they can to survive within the environment that they're in. And part of that survival is dependent on really close allocation of resources, not spending energy on anything you don't have to. And keeping cells alive that don't need to be alive to do their job would be a poor allocation of resources. So parts of the tree that don't need to be alive to do their job, they shut it off. They can still move water, they can still help support the tree, but those cells are turned off. So some of the xylem within the tree, especially the farther in the tree you go, aren't alive. So when you're looking at a tree, you're looking at living tissue wrapped around a dead core. That's part of their differentiation pathway. This is kind of always the plan for those cell types. So if you are, say, a xylem cell, and we'll get into what those specific structures are. But if you're xylem cell, new cells are being created in that secondary meristem, that cambium layer within the tree. And you're born a xylem cell. Your differentiation pathway, what's going to happen to you eventually is you are one of the lucky cells that isn't going to live for hundreds of years. You're going to be there for a fairly short amount of time, and then the tree is going to shut you off. Other cells are a lot longer persisting in the tree. Parenchyma cells, phloem, things like that last a little bit longer. But different cells have different paths, and their destiny, if you will, is different based on what their function is going to be. That also means that for certain cells, once they are assigned a job, that's the only job they're ever going to have, and they aren't going to be able to change. So that just keep that in mind, that certain cells have certain jobs, and that may have a fairly definite end to it at some point. So through this differentiation, cell structure's changed. They're assigned that job. This gives them their specific function. That structure is going to allow them to do certain jobs, and it won't allow them to do others. So once that takes place, for a lot of cells, that's their job, and that's why it stays that way. They're not able to change their structure after it's been assigned. If you have cells with similar structures and functions, if they're built the same way, if they work the same way, that's how we start to classify them or arrange them into tissue types. Now with trees, you're going to deal with three primary groups of tissue. You're going to have dermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue, and we'll talk about what each one of those might be. If you want to compare this to animals, you're going to have different tissue types. You're going to have bones and muscles and nerves and skin and hair and all that kind of stuff. Trees aren't as complicated as all that. So with them, you've got dermal, ground, and vascular. So the first one we're going to talk about is dermal tissue. And if you are looking at a tree, if you're looking at the outside of a tree, everything you see, unless there is a break in that somewhere, where you're actually getting to see inside the tree, everything you're looking at is dermal tissue. The skin of the leaf, the epidermis of the leaf, the bark, everything on the outside of a tree is dermal tissue. So it's a big category. It doesn't mean that they're all going to look the same or anything like that, but they have some functions in common, and that's why they're getting grouped together like that. So those functions are controlling environmental conditions, keeping the tree cool, allowing it to move water, evaporate water, or slow that evaporation down, protection, keeping what's outside the tree, and keeping what's inside the tree, inside the tree. So most of what they're doing is controlling that interaction with the environment, regulating temperatures, regulating entrance and exit into the tree. They influence light passage in leaves. This is going to be a big part of how the trees make food. They also help regulate gas exchange. Gas exchange in a plant is important because part of what I make my food out of is carbon dioxide if I'm a green plant, and that's a gas. So I need to be able to bring enough of that in. I also need oxygen to catalyze a lot of what I'm using as far as sugars for energy. The trees need oxygen just like us. So gas exchange is important. And again, defense. Temperature regulation is important. We get into temperature, a lot of functions that the tree is undertaking, photosynthesis being the main one, is reliant on the tree having a specific internal temperature or an internal temperature that is within a certain range. So temperature regulation is very important. Ground tissue. All right, so we talked about dermal tissue, everything on the outside of the tree, anything covering the outside. Ground tissue is everything except vascular tissue. So it's not phloem, it's not xylem, it's not any of those things that are moving water or sugars. It's everything in between. So I have a lot of my cell types, like my parenchyma cells. Parenchyma or parenchyma serve as a conduit for movement and storage, among other things, between xylem and phloem, um, between parts of the vascular system. So that's what we're talking about primarily, is those cells that occupy the spaces in between the major components of my vascular system and the outside of the tree. So if you're thinking about that, it's not the bark, it's not the outside skin of the leaves, it's not anything like that. It's what is moving between that and the phloem and the xylem is what's taking up that space. It is important to remember that just because it's not actively moving water, it's not actively moving sugar, it is still a major component of the tree. It plays, these type of tissues, ground tissues, play a huge role in defense and storage of the tree, in the tree. And this is also where a tree gets a lot of its support from. So if you can think about a tree being like a bundle of straws, if I reinforce the spaces between them, it's going to make that bundle that much stronger. So ground tissue does that as well. Now on to vascular tissue. Vascular tissue. This is the easiest tissue to see in cross section if you're cutting down a tree or you're taking a slice out of it. You can see those growth rings. It's pretty easy to identify at least some of the structures in there without a microscope or magnifying glass or things like that, if you're looking at the inside of the tree. The two main sections are xylem and phloem. Xylem is responsible for moving water. It brings water up through the roots, up through the tree, and to the top of the tree and out to the leaves. This provides all of the water needed to regulate the internal temperature of the tree. It provides water for photosynthesis, the hydrogen, right? Part of the requirement for photosynthesis is hydrogen and oxygen, is water, H2O, right? So this is where that comes from. It also transports any of the mineral nutrients that the tree needs from the soil. All that is brought in through the roots up to the top of the tree in the xylem. The xylem is both living and non-living, depending on where it's at within the tree. The farther that you go into the tree structure, you're going to have less living xylem. So the phloem, on the other hand, is just on the outside of that secondary meristem, that lateral meristem. It's not usually very thick. It's a few cells thick. It might be only 3-4 cells thick, so it's not a huge layer. So where the sugar is moving down from the leaves after photosynthesis takes place, water's brought up in the xylem, and then that sugar's brought back down through the rest of the tree in the phloem. That happens on the outside. So it's very easy to disrupt sugar movement through the tree or the movement of food through the tree if that dermal layer is damaged, that skin layer is damaged, and we start to get into the inside of the tree, we start to damage that ground tissue and vascular tissue. The phloem is pretty easily disrupted. So if you're going to work with trees, knowing what cell types and what tissue types are where can also help you figure out how serious the damage to the tree is, if there's damage, or how serious of a pest or disease problem you might have, depending on where it is and how it's attacking the tree and how the tree might respond to it. So if we start talking vascular, obviously we have more than one function going on. Some of that is strictly transport. Some of it is also storage. So function is not going to be the same for every single type of vascular tissue, but they do have some things in common. We talked about this with that very first slide with the cell wall. They have a rigid cell wall. It's enduring. It doesn't break down. All that means is if the cell dies, that cell wall remains. It maintains that rigidity even after death. When we look at how that happens, without getting too technical, at least to start, and there's a little bit more of this in the notes that will accompany this, but within those cell walls, we have lignin and cellulose. And this is kind of like the packing material that we were talking about being between those, that bundle of straws. This is what goes inside those spaces, or partially what's in those spaces, and it helps hold up the tree. And it's also what cell walls are made of. And the thing to remember with trees, living trees, and this is another reason why they can live as long as they can. Lignin and cellulose can be regenerated over time. Even in older cells, it can be regenerated. So if I'm talking about surviving, if I'm talking about maintaining rigidity and being able to hold myself up and be structurally sound for as long as possible, this is a big part of how that works, and is also another big part of how trees are different than other plants, and goes back to our definition of being that woody organism that is able to grow taller. This is also what makes a lot of my support in my secondary growth possible, and how that secondary growth strengthens the tree and allows it to be not just a shrub or not just a bush, but be that 60, 70, 80, 300 foot tall, depending on your species plant. Now, xylem changes a little bit in how it's structured. Its function doesn't change, but the parts look a little different, are built just a little differently if I am comparing, say, evergreens to deciduous trees. I have two different types. They're gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms, it means naked seed is what that term means, and that is for the most part referring to evergreens like pine, spruce, trees like that, where I don't have a covered seed. If you look at the cones, you can see the seeds inside them. There's no actual covering. That's part of what that definition for that is. But and angiosperms are hardwood trees, and hardwood's kind of a broad definition. Even trees that you wouldn't consider to be a hardwood, like poplars or things, are still in that group together within that have those that same seed type. And angio just means covered seed. Angiosperm, covered seed. Pieces of the xylem within each of those general types are just a little bit different in their form. Their function's the same, like we said. Their form's just a little bit different. In gymnosperms, for the most part, I'm going to have tracheids, and there's a few angiosperms that have those, but for the most part, I'm talking gymnosperms there. In angiosperms, primarily, the xylem is going to be made up of vessel elements and fibers. Those two things. There's going to be a couple other guys we're going to talk about, and we'll talk about that a little more in the physiology component, or the physiology module. But there are some differences in structure. The function is the same. They just look a little different. And then both types also have those parenchyma cells in there as well to help move between the phloem and the xylem. And we'll talk a little bit more about defense. We'll look at that part of the definition too as we go along in this module, and then in the next one as well. So, moving past xylem, we're not talking about moving water anymore. We're going to move into the phloem. And again, this is outside that lateral meristem, that secondary meristem. It's not in the tips. This is in the cambium, where the tree's getting bigger around. Remember, it's making xylem to the inside, phloem to the out. The main function of phloem is to transport sugar and other food materials. And a lot of this just means like amino acids through the tree. So basic building blocks, basic sugars, basic building blocks of the tree to support existing tissues and to help drive that growth in those meristematic areas of the tree. And what you have to remember with most trees, they're all trees, green plants, they're autotrophs, which means they feed themselves. They're making sugar in the leaves. That's where that starts. That's where photosynthesis for the most part takes place. So those are where the food is being made. It's the food factory in the tree. So you have this system of sources and sinks. And a source is an area where something is generated, and a sink is an area where it's used. So in trees, for most of their lives, most of the year, it doesn't matter what you're talking, the leaves are the source. That's where the food's coming from. This changes a little bit in the spring when I'm bringing stored energy back in to push bud break, but for the most part, leaves are the source. That's where everything's coming from. They make the food there. Amino acids are generated there. A lot of my hormonal chemicals within the tree that drive a lot of the biology of the tree, a lot of what it's doing are generated in the growing points of the tree. So a lot of that's coming from the leaves. And this, so as the source, they feed themselves first. The leaves feed themselves, and then what's left moves down to the stem that they're on. That feeds itself, or that's fed. Moves down to the branch that's on. That's fed, and so on and so forth. So you have this source to sink. It's providing food to where it needs to be. It's being generated in one spot and moving. So that's kind of fundamental to how trees move food, move sugar, move these basic building blocks, these proteins, and everything that they need to make more tissues, to drive cell division, to power cell elongation. That's where a lot of that comes from. There are some nutritional aspects that come up from the soil that are integrated into this flow back down, but it still has to kind of go through the leaf to be redistributed to the tree. In gymnosperms and the evergreens, phloem is composed of sieve cells, and they have another cell with them called an albuminous cell. And that albuminous cell, and there's, when we talk hardwoods, when we talk those angiosperms, there's similar structures there, but they have a unique relationship. Sieve cells are allowing sugar to, or I shouldn't say allowing, they're pushing sugar to where it needs to be. That sink source, it moves through pressure gradients. I have a lot in one area, it builds up pressure and it pushes it to areas where there's lower pressure. So that requires energy to do. Because these sieve cells are busy doing that, using energy, they don't really take care of themselves very well. So they need help. And in order to do their job and to use energy and not die and interrupt that flow of food to the rest of the tree, they need someone watching out for them. And that's what an albuminous cell does. It's that sieve cell sidekick, right? It's watching it work. It's saying, hey, buddy, you look hungry, here's a sandwich. That's kind of what they do, is they provide energy to the sieve cells so they can do their job. So you have these albuminous cells taking care of the sieve cells that are moving sugar through the phloem. So kind of a unique relationship going on in there. If I look at the hardwoods, the deciduous trees, the ones that lose their leaves in the winter, angiosperms, they have, instead of sieve cells, they have sieve tube elements. And these are made up of sieve cells and sieve tube members. So they have a couple of different things working together. But at the end of the day, it's the same basic idea. It's a tube that can help push sugar where it needs to be. So it takes a couple of different components in an angiosperm as opposed to kind of a single part. It's just a little bit less complicated system in a gymnosperm versus an angiosperm. They have some similarities in cell types, and that would be the albuminous cells in a gymnosperm, kind of keeping those sieve cells alive, right? In angiosperms, they have a cell called a companion cell, and it's doing the same job. And that one is maybe a little more aptly named because it's kind of sounds like what it does. It hangs out with these other cells and makes sure that they're getting the energy they need to do their job. So they are not really good at taking care of themselves either. They're doing a lot of work. They're moving sugar. They're building pressure. They're pushing this to other parts of the tree. They need a little buddy there helping them out, giving them some energy, making sure that they survive to do their job. And as we talked before, there are some other types of cells in there, parenchyma cells, sclerenchyma, kind of the same similar thing, that are filling in the spaces in between and helping create a connection from the inside of the tree to the outside of the tree. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important, but some of it is energy storage, some of it is defense. So there's a lot going on in there. When we're talking about angiosperms, we talk about sieve tube members, and we were talking about that a second ago. They kind of work end to end. They're like stacking straws. They form sieve tubes. So that's literally a straw on top of a straw on top of a straw. If I look at the way that gymnosperms are put together, those sieve cells are put together in gymnosperms, it's a little different. They're more like they have tapered ends. So you have a tapered end on top of a tapered end versus a stack of straws. So it makes it a little harder for sugar to move. They can build a little bit more pressure, but that has a lot to do with how they defend themselves and the type of pests that typically attack evergreen trees. So they need to be able to build a little more pressure in those situations. But we'll talk about that when we get to plant health care and disease and diagnosis and those modules and why that's important and why that works the way it does. In angiosperms, they also have a structure within those sieve tubes called a sieve plate. And where those straws join together, it's just a plate. It's got a bunch of holes in it. And it helps in defense, but it's not a very strong part of defense. So they don't ever really shut down what's going on. They can't redirect pressure very effectively in a lot of ways. So it's a structure that's in there. It's something to be aware of, but it's not something that's as effective as what you'll see in a gymnosperm or an evergreen tree. So we're going to start talking about the organ types: leaves, stems, roots, flowers, and fruit. And not that any one organ type obviously is more, maybe not obviously, is more important than any other, but we talked a lot about this already, and that's that trees feed themselves, and they do that through the leaves. Leaves are absolutely integral, required component of a tree being able to survive and feed itself and to create everything it needs to live and defend itself and to adapt to its environment. So when you're talking organ types, I think it's appropriate that we talk about leaves first. They are powered by sunlight 100%. When you look at a leaf and it's green, what you're looking at is a chemical called chlorophyll. And that is what the tree uses in that photosynthetic process. Chlorophyll is the catalyst for breaking down, I shouldn't say it's a catalyst, it's the medium in which the tree uses the sunlight as the catalyst to break down carbon dioxide and water and recombine them to make simple sugars with the process of photosynthesis. So without chlorophyll, without sunlight, without both of those things being in the leaf or captured by the leaf, without carbon dioxide and water, you don't have any of that. So all of those things are absolutely vital to the life of the tree. And chlorophyll is the green substance within the leaves that makes that possible. A side note, pretty much all life on Earth is dependent, at least indirectly, on photosynthesis for survival. So it's a pretty big deal. So the more you can learn about that and how that functions within the tree, and we do talk about that a little more later on in some of the other modules, but the more you can understand about how trees feed themselves and how that process works, how green plants feed themselves. If you're really into the care part of trees, plant health care part, you'll be that much more successful if you understand how that process works. So just kind of a tip there. The other things leaves are responsible for are respiration and transpiration. Respiration is energy use, and transpiration is the movement of water through the tree and evaporation of water out of the leaves, helping pull water through the tree. Leaves have an outer layer, the epidermis, right? That dermal tissue we talked about. There's usually on the outside of the leaf a waxy covering called the cuticle. It just helps retain water inside the tree, helps it not evaporate as much, helps it regulate that a little bit better. Most leaves, all leaves, have openings in them called stomata. Stomata are just that, just an opening in the underside of a leaf that allows water vapor to move out of the leaf, to water to evaporate out of the tree's system. On both sides of those stomatal openings are cells called guard cells. And guard cells either swell or shrink, and all they do is open or close those openings. So regulate water movement. If they're closed, the tree's not moving water. If they're open, the tree's moving water. This helps pull water through the tree. We're pulling those nutrients from the soil. We're pulling water up to the leaves so I can make sugar out of it. But I'm also evaporating water out. I'm moving water out of the tree. I'm evaporating water out of the tree. And this is a huge part of how the tree regulates its internal temperature. If I can't evaporate water out of the tree, I can't lower my internal temperature. I can't keep the temperature down. Trees work like very large evaporative coolers. This is how they pull heat out of their system. Trees do have basic cell mechanics, just like anything else. They burn ATP, and we'll talk about what that is. I just want you to get used to the concept of it for energy within their cells, and that generates heat. So there is internal heat in the tree, and there's also environmental impact, the sun shining on them. So they have a lot to deal with. They have to dissipate some of that heat, primarily so they don't cook themselves internally, but also because photosynthesis, which they are completely dependent on, is only efficient within a certain temperature range. So if I get too cold, 50, 54 degrees, somewhere in there, I start to drop in efficiency. If I get too hot, above about 85, it starts to break down a little bit too. So, and that's Fahrenheit. If I'm not between those temperatures, or ideally between those temperatures internally, my efficiency, my photosynthetic efficiency really drops off, and I have trouble making sugar. I'm not making food as well, and that's a stress, and that can cause lots of problems. When we talk about tree problems later on, stresses are what we're talking about. It doesn't matter if we're talking environmental stress or insect stress or disease stress or whatever it might be, but food stress, temperature stress are something that trees deal with all day long, every day, and it's something that they're very concerned about because it affects their ability to make food. So that's why transpiration is important. The internal tissues inside the leaf consist of the mesosphyle. The mesosphyle, and you don't have to really necessarily remember that term in and of itself, but what you have to remember is within the leaf, there are areas where photosynthesis takes place, and there's areas where it's just moving stuff around for the most part. And the mesosphyle is where photosynthesis happens in the tree. That's where the chloroplasts are that have chlorophyll within them. So that's where all the green stuff is. That's where photosynthesis is happening. There's also xylem and phloem Bundled within the leaves, they're very close together. They're touching each other within the leaves. So I do have vascular tissue inside the leaf as well. And when I have vascular tissue in direct contact with the portions of the leaf that are photosynthesizing in the mesophyll, that makes moving that sugar into the vascular tissue very easy. It also means that I'm getting water delivered right where it needs to be through that xylem. Once the sugar is in that vascular tissue, is within that phloem, it's translocated to other parts of the plant. It's moved to where it needs to be. I'm building up pressure in the leaves. I'm moving it to where it needs to be. I'm taking it from that sink area and moving it to that, or taking it from that source area and moving it to that sink area. All right. The next organ we're talking about, organ type, is a stem. The stem can be a twig, branch, trunk. It's those parts of the tree that we're talking about when we're referring to a stem. It's one of two main structural axes in the tree. What does that mean? Well, you have lateral meristems and secondary meristems, right? Apical meristems and secondary meristems or lateral meristems. I have that growth at the tips, and I have that secondary growth in that cambium in the stems, the trunks and the branches. So it's one of two growing points in the tree. When I say stem, I know that's a lot of the tree. There's a lot of secondary growth taking place. Stems are divided into nodes and internodes. And it's a fancy way of saying areas where there's a bud and areas where there's not. So at the end of the stem, there's going to be a terminal bud, that apical meristem. That's what a terminal bud is, right? Just that growing point at the end. But then as you move down the stem, as you move down the twig, you have buds. And you see this every spring when the buds swell and the leaves break. So anywhere there's a bud on a stem or a twig, that's a node. An area between two buds is an internode. It's not more complicated than that. Don't make it more complicated than that. So anywhere there's a bud, that's a node, and the area between those an internode. Some buds can be hidden, or they can be dormant. They can be just under the bark where you can't see them. Those you don't have to worry about too much most of the time, unless you lose your terminal bud and then they come into play, and we'll get into that a little bit. But for all intents and purposes, just remember node and internode, buds, no buds. We have a similar structure in the roots, and you can think of roots as being a structural axis of the tree, the same way that I have apical meristems and secondary or lateral meristems in the top. I have the same thing going on in the roots, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. When we talk stems, above ground at least, they have four main functions: support, transport, storage of nutrients, and this is also where that secondary meristem is, production of new living tissue. So, terminal bud. Why is the terminal bud important? It's the one that's the end of the shoots, the apical meristem. That's where I get my growth at the end of the branch. It's the most active bud on the branch. Most lateral buds, and all lateral bud is anything that's not that bud at the branch tip. If it's farther down the branch, the twig, or the whatever you want to call it, whatever stem you're talking about, if it's not the one at the very end, it's lateral. If it's the one at the end, it's apical. That's the difference between the two. The terminal bud, the one at the end, the apical bud, exhibits a trait called apical dominance, and it means that bud is in charge. There are hormones produced in that growing point called auxins that control the growth of every other bud down that particular stem that it's on, that it's in control of. And what it is there for, what that control is there for, is so that we don't have all of the lateral buds and and dormant buds activated all at the same time. So it's not growing more than it can support. It's growing within the limits of the resources that it has. That's that apical buds, that terminal buds job, is to make sure that it's not growing past what it can afford to spend. So what it does is it inhibits the growth and development of some of the lateral buds on that same shoot. This is also a way for the tree to kind of react to damage. Say I get a branch that's ripped off or the end of a branch that's broken off. I lose that apical control or that apical dominance, and I can replace that broken part very quickly, because now that control is not there. Everything starts to grow at once and to replace that part of the canopy or that part of that branch that's lost. So it's part of how it responds to damage as well. But for the most part, it's there to suppress growth to the point that the tree is growing within the limits of what it's got for resources available to it. So top growth doesn't outgrow what food it can produce, the nutrients that are available in the soil, the water that's available, that kind of thing. So pretty important system in the tree. It's a pretty important part of its response to changes in the environment, especially damage. Removal of that bud, like I said, causes anything that's dormant and anything that's being shut off, at least temporarily, by those hormones in that terminal bud to become active. So when that end of that branch is broken off or trimmed off or topped out of a tree, that's why you get water sprout growth. That's why you get all this extra growth within the tree. You'll also see that termed epicormic, adventitious, different types of growth, but they're all talking about the same thing, and that's just dormant buds becoming activated because we lost that apical dominance, or that dominance from that terminal bud. If I have trees that are very strongly dominant or exhibit very strong apical dominance, I will get a tree that's excurrent or very upright, very straight, central lead, upright form. They won't spread out a lot. A lot of your evergreen trees can be that way. Spruce, firs can be that way. But you can also get that in deciduous trees. Certain trees like linden have a tendency to really show strong apical dominance. It's termed excurrent is the term for that type of tree. If I don't have very strong dominance, I tend to get a decurrent tree, one that's more spreading. I don't necessarily have a lot of really strong upright growth, and this can be a lot of different trees. Something that's really easy to see it in are like fruit trees like apples and pears and things like that tend to be really decurrent and don't have a strong lead in them. Terminal buds are important in the stems, like we talked, because they do control growth. Auxins are the hormone that's produced in the terminal bud. In the roots, in the tips of the roots, the hormones are a little different. They're called cytokinins, and their role is it's basically the same. It dominates buds along those roots, along those stems in the roots, or along the length of the roots, so you don't get unnecessary root growth. But the interesting thing between auxins and cytokinins is they have the opposite effect on the top of the tree versus the bottom of the tree. If I apply auxins to a root, it actually encourages it to grow and doesn't suppress that growth. And cytokinins do the same to the top of the tree, where if I apply cytokinin, that type of hormone to the top of the tree, it will activate dormant buds instead of suppressing them. So while it suppresses root growth, it encourages top growth, and auxins suppress top growth and encourage root growth. So that's another way that hormones within the tree help keep it in balance. Helps keeps the top of the tree in balance with what the roots can provide and keeps the roots in balance with what the top is providing. So they're not outgrowing each other. That happens in your stems. And that doesn't matter if you're talking stems below ground or stems above ground. Auxins are also involved in different types of tropisms. And tropisms are just growth in reaction to some kind of stimulus. And this can be light. It can be phototropism. That's reaction to light. It can be geotropism, which is the reaction to polar gravity. So there's different tropisms. There's aerotropism, which is response to air movement or wind. There's all of these different external stimulus to the tree. It has to be able to react to those. If it's being shaded out, it needs to be able to grow to where the sunlight is. If there's water available and the roots encounter that, that's how it responds to that. It releases more of those hormones, encouraging roots to grow in those areas where it's running into things that it needs, or more nutrients in the soil, or whatever it might be. Pretty important part of how they react to their environment. Stems consist of 3 tissues. We talked about these: dermal, ground, and vascular. The dermal tissue is on the outside, just like anywhere else. Skin of the tree. Same functions. It doesn't matter if you're talking in leaves, if I'm talking in the stems, if I'm talking in the roots. We're still talking about waterproofing the outside of the tree, protecting it from the environment, controlling gas exchange. Ground tissue in stems is going to be mostly parenchyma cells. Remember, those are moving within that vascular tissue. That's not only allowing movement from phloem to the xylem, xylem to the phloem, but it's also moving out to cork cambium. There's a small layer of cell division on the outside that's not really contributing to secondary growth. It's not making the tree bigger around, but what it does do is it contributes to the bark formation on the outside of the tree. So I need a connection with that as well, and that happens in the parenchyma cells. In thin bark trees, if you think poplars like aspen or birch or trees like that, if I have very thin bark, there might be some photosynthesis going on in those bark fissures where it's very thin, cell are too thick. I can still, it's transparent enough that I can absorb some sunlight there. So the tree may be undergoing photosynthesis in some of those areas, at least a very small amount of photosynthesis may be taking place. So it also allows the sugars that are being produced there to be moved into that vascular tissue. Vascular tissue in the stems is obviously talking about vascular tissue in the trunk. So that's transport, that's long distance transport in the tree, and storage into lower parts of the tree like the roots. So I have some reserve for the next season and then bringing that back up. All right, dicots. I have 2 types of trees. I have dicots and monocots. We're not going to talk too much about monocots, but we'll get into that. Most of the trees that we deal with as arborists on a daily basis, at least in most of the country. If you're getting into tropical areas or subtropical areas, some of the coastal areas, you're gonna deal with a lot of monocots with palm trees being mostly palm trees. But for the rest of the country, most of what we're talking about is dicots or dicotyledons. And all dicot and monocot means is single growing point or multiple growing points. And it's really talking about where those apical buds are, terminal buds are. If I look at a palm tree, for example, that monocot, that single growing point, it's the top of the tree. There's one growing point. They get taller. They don't get a whole lot bigger around. They do get a little bit bigger around as they grow, but they don't really have secondary growth. It's pretty much all that primary growth. They get taller. They've got one growing point. Dicots, if I think about that in contrast to, say, that oak tree, every branch tip's a growing point. Right? I have multiple growing points versus a single. So dicots, it just means multiple growing points. actually means one seed leaf or two seed leaves, but multiple growing points versus single growing points. Dicot stems have pith or heartwood in the center with vascular bundles outside of that forming rings. When we get into identification a little bit, we'll talk about diffuse porous trees versus ring porous trees and what that means. But that's where you're going to be looking at that. So when we look at growth rings, that's what we're looking at as vascular bundles. Soft layers are usually the living layers of the tree. That's going to be the phloem, the cambium, and then a few layers of xylem. That's going to be where most of my functioning vascular tissue is. There's going to be some parenchyma cells that run into the inside of the tree, but when I talk about the sapwood versus heartwood or the pith, sapwood is going to be the living portion of the tree. The central core of most trees, or dark hardwood and tree trunks, is going to be the inside of the tree. Is going to be a dead portion is xylem. It's no longer living. The tree will usually pack it full of something. It could be oil, it could be resin. Some trees will use tannins because they resist insect attack better, things like that. There's usually something put into place to help defend the tree because they are not actively living. They don't react well to injury, and the tree can't handle defense there as well as it normally would with living portions of the tree. So there's some things put into place to help with defense that maybe are not always successful. We'll talk about that too, but that's going on in the heartwood. So woody dicots, most trees, that's most of the trees, have secondary growth in the secondary meristem. We've talked about that. That's that growth in the cambium, right? Phloem to the outside, xylem to the inside. The vascular cambium and the cork cambium are part of that. That's the two growing points. The vascular cambium is the primary, or I shouldn't say primary, is the secondary growing point in the tree. We have apical meristem, secondary meristem, or lateral meristem. That's what we're talking about, is that vascular cambium. It's creating phloem, it's creating xylem. We also have a cork cambium that is strictly responsible for forming cork cells. It should be a continuous cylinder around the tree. Obviously, sometimes that gets interrupted by damage. And we'll talk about that in relation to defense and how the trees handle that and how that works into our definition a little bit later on. But the primary thing to remember, at least at this point in anatomy, is cambium cells, secondary meristem, that lateral meristem. That's where cell division is taking place to produce xylem and phloem. Xylem's on the inside of that cambium layer, phloem's on the outside. As I get an increase in the stem diameter during that production, I start to see the cortex and the epidermis that's outside start to be destroyed and replaced with that cork cambium, and it starts to produce a material called phellogen. So when you look at younger trees, thin bark trees, and how that bark changes over time, how it starts to become rougher, more fissured, that's what's going on, is that initial epidermis, that initial cortex and epidermis that the tree had when it was younger is starting to be destroyed and replaced with tougher tissues that are better able to defend the tree as it gets larger. The technical term for bark is going to be periderm. You don't have to remember that, but that's what that cork cambium is producing, is that periderm layer of the tree. Now, there is something that's important to remember, is that gas exchange is still important in the trunk. It's not quite as important as it is in the leaves. We're not so much worried with transpiration, at least not to the extent we are of moving water all the way to the leaves for photosynthesis. But what we are worried about is being able to maintain columns of water up through the top of the tree. And part of how we do that is by evaporating a little bit of moisture through the trunk. And we have areas that are similar to stomata in the trunk called lenticels. It's just an area of cells where they're not quite as tight. They're not packed together quite as tightly. You can kind of think of a lenticel versus stomata. A stomata is a window that's open, but it has shutters, the guard cells that can close it off completely. A lenticel is more like a screen window, a screen. It's open all the time. You can't close it off completely, but it's still got something covering a little bit. So getting into monocots just a little bit. In monocots, we don't have vascular tissue, these layers, these cylinders, these straws within straws within straws like we do in dicots. In monocots, you have little tiny bundles. You have cambium and xylem and phloem all in one place, but those places where it is, it's not a cylinder around the tree. It's a bunch of it all scattered through the trunk. So there's no uniform rings that are made in monocots. They can be concentrated towards the outside a little bit, but for the most part, it's pretty much scattered through the trunk. That's why you don't get as much secondary growth in palm trees or monocots. So when we're talking stems, we have hardwoods like oak, maple, and walnut, angiosperms. Those are going to be when we're talking woody dicots, those are going to be what we're pretty much referring to. Gymnosperms are woody plants. They're very similar to what we would term a woody dicot as far as hardwood trees. Like we talked before, everything's pretty much a hardwood if it's not an evergreen or gymnosperm. There's some very minor differences in their xylem in the trees. And we talked about that a little bit before. In gymnosperms, in those evergreen trees, they only have tracheids in the xylem. The other thing that they have that my hardwoods don't have, that the angiosperms don't have, is they have resin ducts. So they can produce resin in there as part of their defense mechanism. So there's some differences there in how they defend themselves, and that's primarily because of the threats that they face from different pests or from their predominant pests or their primary pests in their environments. So there are some things that are a little bit different there, but for the most part, not too different. Dicots, woody dicots, the hardwoods, like I said, are vessels versus tracheids in the gymnosperms, but doing the same job in that xylem. All right, another organs. The root, now we're going to talk roots. Roots are the organs of the plant that are usually below the surface of the soil. They don't have to be. There are roots that can be above the soil, and this happens when conditions are right, or I have very heavy soils, or I have very wet soils, very dense soils, and roots can't penetrate or can't grow there, or I have areas where the environment's just better for them. And you could think of areas where there might be some kind of soil interface like pavement or concrete over soil where I might get good condensation or oxygen content or things like that that might contribute to a better environment for roots to live in. So I can have aerial roots. I can have roots that are aerating or above the soil, but a lot of them are going to be primarily, obviously, roots are going to be primarily under the soil. They can also grow inside the tree itself if you have areas of the tree that are decayed or included bark areas, and we'll talk about what that is a little bit later on and what that looks like. But the tree can also grow roots in areas where it normally wouldn't. We talk about cells being able to differentiate or cells differentiating when they are created or transdifferentiating depending on the environment they're in. Like the parenchyma can transdifferentiate or change their jobs. They can become they can become roots through that process if the environment's correct for that. So a better definition for the root is maybe not one that specifically says it has to be underground, but talks more about an organ that is really for absorption, aeration, bringing oxygen into the tree, storage as far as food storage, or means to anchor or support the tree, to hold it up, to provide structural support. That's different from a stem. And the other thing with roots is they don't necessarily have nodes or buds the way that we talk about stems, and they don't have leaves. So there are some important differences between what a stem is and what a root is. And that's why you have those two different organ types, although there are a lot of similarities between the two, and it could probably be argued that they should be included in the stems category. Early root growth is a function of the apical meristem. So roots, just like the top of the tree, they get longer, they get bigger around. The difference with roots is instead of this process of division, elongation, and then secondary growth, they don't ever really stop growing at that apical meristem. They tend to keep growing constantly. There's not that period of division and elongation. They tend to keep growing continuously throughout the life of the tree, producing more roots, more meristem. They also have a major difference in how the meristem cells are formed, in that there is a root cap, or there are root cap cells at the end of that root, at the root tip, to protect it as it's pushing through the soil. And those are sloughed off constantly as those roots are being generated. So they grow very similar to the apical meristems on the top of the tree, with the exception of that they don't stop growing. Process is not necessarily different, it just doesn't stop, or it doesn't take a break through the season. It doesn't divide and elongate, it just keeps going. When we talk about those root cap cells being sloughed off, they contribute to the environment around the roots. I do want people to realize that the activity in the soil is a little bit different than what you see at above ground parts of the tree. There's a lot more interface or interaction with microorganisms in the soil. Soil biology is very important to tree health. And one of the things that when we talk about this later on that we deal with is why a lot of those organisms are there, or how those relationships with the tree works. And there's an area that is directly around the tree roots that is there, at least in part, because of the tree constantly contributing organic matter to the soil for food, for these microorganisms that are there in that area where that organic matter is sloughed off by the tree, and these microorganisms are there, bacteria, fungi, all these different things that are very active around tree roots are there. That area is called the rhizosphere. So it's something that's important to know, that there is a relationship, not just with the tree and the soil, but with the tree and the soil and the things that live in the soil. And part of why they are so active around tree roots is because of this kind of give or take, or the tree supplying food through these old cells that have been sloughed off as it moves through the soil. It really demonstrates well, and you can see it very well here, that this is a root tip. You can see that meristematic zone, that growing point, but you can see the root tip and the root cap, and those are the cells that we're talking about being sloughed off as that cell, those root cells elongate and push that meristem forward, pushing that root tip forward. Those root cap cells are there to protect it. Those are what are pushed off or sloughed off into the soil. So within the roots, I still have vascular cambium. They're still going to get bigger around. I still have that secondary or that lateral meristem in there. I still have vascular cambium. It's still forming xylem and phloem. So as roots move through the soil, they change their roles. They begin as very fine roots, root hairs. Their main job is absorption. They're bringing in water. They're bringing in nutrients. As they age and they go through years of growth and they become bigger, their role changes to one of transport and storage, and eventually they become structural, where their main job is helping to anchor the tree or hold it in place. A true root system, if we're looking at tree roots, consists of a primary root and secondary or lateral roots. So they are generational. I have the primary root, the root that keeps going, and then everything that branches off of that, secondary, lateral. If the roots are damaged, I have those lateral roots that break off from that and take over that role, at least hopefully take over that role. Adventitious roots are roots that don't necessarily follow that sequence and originate from a stem, branches above ground. If I have, like we talked before, flooded conditions, heavy soil, clay soils, rocks, or those areas where it makes sense to put it on roots above ground. Or if I get branches or sections of the trunk that are buried or come in contact with the soil, I can get roots that start in those areas or even internally in the tree. Aerial roots, again, are those that are entirely above ground. And then I have propagated roots also that form adventitious buds that can develop into above ground shoots. What does that mean? It just means that I have roots that are designed, or their major job is to make more trees. We see this with aspens, poplars, that family, and a few others. But in those root systems, propagated roots are how the tree reproduces primarily. It's not necessarily that they don't make seeds or they don't reproduce that way, but the major push is going to be for them to grow a little ways and push up another tree, or grow a little ways and push up another tree, and they do that through propagated root production. Flowers are another organ type we need to talk about. This is the reproductive part of the tree. So if you want to know how tree sex works, most of the time it's going to be flowers where the action is really going on, where they're making more seeds, where they're making more trees. Flowers are a lot of times termed inflorescence. If you're talking biology, you'll hear that term a lot. It's just the flower of a tree. Doesn't mean that they're pretty or bright colored or anything like that. All flowers are not really noticeable, but when we talk inflorescence or flowers, we're talking about the reproductive unit of a tree, if it's seed-bearing or seed-bearing plants. So flowers have some very specific structures within them. They have carpels, petals, sepals, and stamens. Stamens are made up of an anther and a filament, and hopefully you can see all of those labeled very well in the illustration. So if you want to know what parts are which, the boy parts are the anthers, and the filaments or the stamen. The girl parts, the stigma, which is pistil, ovary, sepals, all that stuff, carpels. So they have that's how, if you ever want to look at a tree and tell if it's a boy or a girl, if I have a flower that only has stamens, in it, it's a boy. If it only has a pistil, it's a girl. If it has both, it's a hermaphrodite, it's self-fertile. So this is where you can look and see if trees are self-fertile or if they require a male and a female, a pollinator and a female. If I want fruit production or if I want to control fruit production, that's a good way of doing that. Is picking a tree that has to have a pollinator and then not putting the pollinator in it. Fruit, we talk about fruit, it's an organ type. Simple fruits are formed from a single ovary. And if you go back and look at your flowers, it's going to give you an idea of what kind of fruit to expect on a tree, or at least if it's going to be aggregate or multiple or simple based on the type of flower that's there. So if I look at trees like apples or pears or hawthorns, where I have one flower that becomes one fruit, that's going to be a simple fruit. They can be either fleshy or dry. They can be nuts and grains, things like that are really dry. But the flowers are going to have the same type of structures. They're going to be a single ovary, and they might have more than one seed, but they're going to be a single ovary, and they're going to make a simple fruit. So apples, pear, things like that. Aggregate fruits are formed from a compound flower. It might have something like raspberries. If you're going to look in the bushes, strawberries, things like that are pretty good examples of aggregate fruits. In trees, you're going to see this with magnolias. That's going to be an aggregate fruit. Multiple fruits, this is mulberries, things like that. So, and accessory fruits, other tissues develop into the edible portion. So apple would be an accessory fruit. So when you look at this, an example of this would be the flower itself becoming the skin of the apple and the apple growing inside the flower. So a little bit different construction, but still kind of along the same idea. It's still simple, just utilizing more of the tissues that are present. The exocarp is the outside layer or peel in fruits. Mesocarp is the middle layer or pith. And then if I have a seed or hollow area in the tree, that's going to be, the endocarp is going to be around that. So if you can remember those three parts, you can remember the parts of most fruit. Mesocarp is the part that you're going to eat in those for the most part. So fairly easy to remember which structures or which part of fruit. I don't know that it's life or death that you remember all of that stuff, but it's nice to know what you're looking at. And then depending on where your career takes you or what you're trying to learn about, it can be a good tool when it comes to identification or treatment for certain insects and diseases. What part of the tree they're attacking, if symptoms show up in certain areas and with certain insects, what point in fruit development do you need to treat to address some insect problems or disease issues, things like that. And with that, I think we've covered pretty much the parts of the tree pretty well. We're going to go into physiology next and actually look at how a lot of these internal structures work together, especially in defense, and how things are arranged internally so that the tree can support itself but also protect itself, and further our definition and get a little bit farther into what a tree is and what makes a tree a tree.